Welcome once again, my fellow manipulators of digital fate. I'm Richie, this is Capricorn, and today is the official start of spoiler season for Modern Horizons 3, which means we have our first slew of official spoilers to go over for the set. Now, I know there have been a bunch of leaks over the last few weeks, but it's nice to finally see spoiler season start proper, get past the leaks, and get on to official spoilers by Wizards of the Coast. Now, one thing I want to point out really quick before we start is some of the cards that are spoiled today are things that have leaked over the last few weeks. I'm still going to cover them in this video so that we can just make sure we cover all of our bases for people who don't pay attention to leaks specifically. But I am going to gloss over them pretty quickly since we kind of already know the details about those cards. So before we dive in, make sure you like the video if you haven't yet. It's you guys liking every video that has helped this channel to grow so quickly. So thank you so much to all of you guys that do it. And if you're new here, subscribe so you never miss an upload. Tons of content coming for spoiler season. Tons of cool deck techs for Outlaws of Thunder Junction. Now let's dive right in. We're going to start with some lower rarity stuff. This is Serum Visionary, a 2/2 Vedalken wizard for 1 blue and 2. When he enters the battlefield, you draw a card and then scry 2. So we're seeing the habit that Wizards has here of taking an iconic card and stapling it onto a creature and making a version of that that's a creature. This one being Serum Visions. Kinda cool. Will probably be useful and limited. But moving on, we've got Trickster's Elk. This is 1 green and 2 for a 3/3 enchantment elk with bestow 1 green and 1. And if you play it from your graveyard for the bestow cost, it's going to come in as an aura enchanting a creature. Enchanted creature loses all abilities and is a green elk creature with base power and toughness 3/3. So even though Oko's not in the set, I guess Oko's kind of in the set. I mean, what would a Modern Horizons set be without a way to elk a creature, right? But being able to just play this early as fodder in limited to trade with an opponent's creature or whatnot, but then come back as potentially removal if you're enchanting your opponent's creature, or maybe even buff if it's on one of your little Eldrazi Scion creature token dudes. Some nice little versatility, pretty cool card, and I like that it's an enchantment as well. I wonder if that matters more than just beyond the fact that it's a bestow aura, but moving on, we've got Frogmere Enforcer. We saw this card during leak season, but this is the official spoiler finally. This is 7 mana for a 4/4, but it has affinity for artifacts. So if you have, 7 artifacts in play, you can actually play this as a 4/4 for 0 mana, which is kind of nutty. But then it's also got this prototype ability where instead of being closer to a Mirror Enforcer, now it's closer to a Frogmite if you play it as the prototype. So 1 green and 3, it comes down as a 2/2. Again, it still has affinity for artifacts, so if you have 3 artifacts out, you can play this for just 1 red mana, get a 2/2 if you're not quite ready to play it as the 4/4. So some really cool versatility there, will probably be useful in limited. Moving on, we've got Brain Surge. This is like Brainstorm turned up to 11. This is 1 blue and 2 for an instant, draw 4 cards, and then put 2 cards from your hand on top of your library in any order. It's cool that it's an instant. It's cool that you get to see an extra card, but also get to keep an extra card, more so than Brainstorm. But other than that, this is just kind of a limited tool to refill your hand, to get to your bombs. It'll be decent at that. Next up, we've got Grim Servant. This is 1 black and 3 for a 3/2 zombie warlock with menace. And when it enters the battlefield, you search your library for a card with mana value less than or equal to your devotion to black. Reveal it, and then put it into your hand and shuffle. You lose 3 life. So it's a creature that's also a tutor. It's worth noting, if you have ways to flicker this, you can just keep tutoring. Granted, you have to lose 3 life each time. You also have to be in a very high devotion to black, so this is mainly made for like mono black decks. It really makes me wonder, with it being an uncommon, if mono black is going to be a realistic archetype within limited. We'll have to try it out when the set drops on Arena for sure, but I'm thinking with it being an uncommon, it has to be geared towards some kind of a valid archetype that's in limited, right? So hopefully there's a spot for this there. Next up, we've got Izzet Generatorium. This is 2 mana in the colors of Izzet for an artifact. if you would get one or more energy counters, you get that many plus 1 energy instead. So it's going to give you extra energy every time you get energy. You can also tap it and draw a card, but activate only if you've paid or lost 4 or more energy this turn. So if you're in the deck that's doubling down on energy, you're able to make a bunch of energy each turn, or maybe there's one turn where you can't make a bunch of energy, but you're using a bunch of energy in that one turn, you're able to effectively just draw an extra card every single turn, as long as you're making big energy swings. And the fact that this is going to give you that extra energy right off the bat means that you only actually need to generate like 3 energy a turn because you're getting that extra 1. And in fact, if you're generating that energy from 2 different sources, you need even less. If you can generate 1 energy from one source and 1 energy from another source, each of them will give you an extra energy with this in play, which will add up to your 4 energy, and then you can just tap this to draw a card. So if you are deep into energy, this is a really, really good way of not only multiplying the energy that you make, but drawing a free card every turn. Seems pretty good. I can't wait to try it in Limited. Moving on, we've got Disciple of Freyalise. Now, this is part of a cycle that we've seen that is modal double face card lands. They have land on the backside. They're bringing this mechanic concept back from Zendikar, which is really interesting. I always really like this concept as a way to sort of mitigate flooding or mana screw. And it's interesting that they're going back to the well with it. But this is 3 green and 3 for a 3/3 elf druid, and when it enters, you may sacrifice another creature. If you do, you gain X life and draw X cards, where X is that creature's power. So it's expensive, but it gives you the ability to gas up on cards and pad out your life total by sacking one of your high power guys, while also still having a 3/3 body on the field, which also means you could theoretically flicker it and get it to re-trigger, do things like that. But then on the backside, if you need to, you can play it as Garden of Freyalise. When it enters the battlefield, you can pay 3 life. If you don't, it enters tapped, and then it taps for 1 green. So just like a lot of the other modal double face cards that are lands that we saw during leak season, this it has that ability from the mythic lands in Zendikar where you can pay the life to make it come into play untapped, which makes it much, much more playable. But in this case, it just taps for one green. But in the right circumstances, you might need that land, and it could make all the difference in the world. Moving on, we've got Witch Enchanter. This one's kind of fun. It's a 2/2 human warlock for 1 white and 3. And when it enters the battlefield, you destroy target artifact or enchantment an opponent controls. Witch Enchanter? Disenchanter. Disenchanter. It disenchants things. That's actually kind of funny. The backside here, it can come into play as a land, Witch Blessed Meadow. And again, if it enters, if you pay 3 life, you can have it come into the battlefield untapped. Otherwise, it's tapped, and it just taps for 1 white mana. So it seems like there's a whole cycle, 1 for each color of this, and then it also seems like there's probably some multicolor, but we're not quite there to the point where they're spoiling those yet. So we'll see what comes up in the next coming days. Next up, we've got Mogg Mob. Now this one's kind of interesting. This Wizards has a history of taking a card and then taking 3 of those cards and mashing them together into just 1 new card. They did this with Llanowar Elves. This one is no different. This is Mogg Mob. This is basically 3 Mogg Fanatics just smashed together. It's a 3/3 goblin for 3 red mana, and you can sacrifice it to deal 3 damage divided as you choose among 1, 2, or 3 targets. So it's literally like 3 Mogg Fanatics, where you get to split that damage up however you need to, hit whatever you need to. Seems like a really fun card. It's going to be really good in Limited because you have removal, potentially even multiple pieces of removal stapled onto a creature. So you do have to be deep into red to make it work with that 3 red mana pips, but I think it's pretty rad. Next up, we've got Wormcoil Larva. This is like what? Baby Wormcoil engine? This is a 3/3 artifact Phyrexian Worm, artifact creature Phyrexian Worm for 2 black and 3. It has Death Touch and Lifelink, and when it dies, you create a 1/2 black Phyrexian Worm artifact creature token with Death Touch, and a 2/1 black Phyrexian Worm artifact creature token with Lifelink. So it's literally just a smaller version of Wormcoil engine that makes little dudes left behind with Lifelink and Death Touch, which is kind of interesting. I think for limited, this is going to be insane. It still has the death touch. It still trades with whatever you want and gives you 2 extra bodies, one of which can trade with whatever you want, and the other one can pad out your life total each turn, theoretically. That's just a lot of value, right? It's kind of like a 3-for-1 already on its own as an uncommon. I think the card's pretty nuts. I can't wait to use it in limited for sure. But moving on, before we get to the rares, we're going to talk about the commander cards. So starting here, we've got Crib Swap. This is 1 white and 2 for a Kindred Instant Shapeshifter. So it technically counts as a creature type shapeshifter, which is interesting, even though it's an instant. It's Changeling, so it's every creature type. You exile a creature, and its controller creates a 1/1 colorless shapeshifter creature token with Changeling. Pretty interesting. Most of the time, you're going to use this as removal for your opponent's stuff and just leave them with a 1/1, take out their big bomb, of which there are many in Modern Horizons 3. But sometimes, maybe you can use this to replace one of your nothing token creatures with a token creature that's now every creature type and can maybe get some Lord benefits. I don't see that happening very often, but it is a potential use. Next up, we've got Hideous Taskmaster. This is 1 red and 6 for a 7/2 Eldrazi with Devoid, so it's technically no color, even though it costs red to play it. When you cast this spell, for each opponent, you gain control of up to 1 target creature that player controls until end of turn. Untap those creatures, they gain Trample, Haste, and Annihilator 1 until end of turn. And this has Trample, Haste, and Annihilator 1 as well. So, a ton of value here. It's basically a threaten for every single player sitting at the table if you're playing a multiplayer game of Commander, which is kind of nuts. But it's even better than that, because all of those creatures you steal are going to swing in with Trample and Annihilator 1, which means it's going to be really hard to prevent them from dealing damage to the opponent. And then when they do, you're going to be able to trigger that Annihilator 1. So, kind of insane. I feel like this guy's going to be really, really good. Obviously, much, much better in a multiplayer Commander table, but pretty good just in general. Next up, we've got Apex Devastator. Have we had enough Cascade yet? This is a 10/10 Chimera Hydra for 10 mana, 2 green and 8. That's a lot, but it has Cascade and Cascade and Cascade and Cascade. So it cascades 4 times, and each of those Cascade triggers is a separate trigger. So if you have anything that can, multiply triggers, get triggers to trigger an additional time when they trigger, that sort of thing, each of these can actually exponentially increase, which gets kind of crazy. But that being said, it is a very, very expensive card, right? So, I don't know. I'm sure there are some Commander decks that are going to want to see this, but jury's out. Jury's out. It's expensive, but man, it does so much. Next up, we've got �YoTi Ancient. This is a 2/4 legendary elemental for 4 mana in the colors of Simic, and when he enters the battlefield, you make a 1/1 green forest dryad land creature token for each time you've cast your commander from the command zone this game. And then at the beginning of each combat, land creatures you control get +X/+X until end of turn, where X is �ＹoTi's power. So this wants to be in a commander deck that is using specifically land creatures, ways of making land creatures so that you can buff them up and basically overrun and get through for an Apex strike and win. But it's really, really interesting that the later it is in the game, the more times you've played your commander, the better this card gets, which is interesting. Do you actually play this as your commander? I mean, you could, since it's a legendary creature, but I almost wonder if it works better in the 99. Either way, really fun card. And next up, we've got Archon of Cruelty. This is 2 black and 6 for a 6/6 flying Archon. When it enters the battlefield or attacks, target opponent sacrifices a creature or planeswalker, discards a card, and loses 3 life. You draw a card and gain 3 life. So, metric ton of value here. Even if you are reanimating it from the graveyard to get it out quicker, it's going to get that ability when it enters the battlefield, just give you a ton of value, and then every time it swings, it's going to get that value again. So, really, really crazy card. That being said, it's meant for Commander, and it only hits 1 player, so is it good enough? Does this allow you to partake in politics across the table and single out players, or maybe make players afraid of being hit by this and have to bargain with you. Who knows? Commander's a crazy format, but we're going to move on. Coram, the Undertaker. This is sort of like a backup commander in the Jund pre-constructed deck. This is a 0/5 legendary human warrior for 4 mana in the colors of Jund. He gets +X/+O, where X is the greatest power among creature cards in all graveyards, including your opponent's, which is awesome. Whenever he attacks, each player mills a card, both your opponent and you. And then during each of your turns, you may play a land and cast a spell from among cards in graveyards that were put there from libraries this turn. So this guy fits perfectly in with like Lurgoyf Tribal. He is in the Lurgoyf Tribal Commander pre-constructed deck. That's where you can get him. And I mean, his abilities sync up with that perfectly. The fact that each player mills a card helps make all of your Lurgoyfs that much bigger. And the fact that you can play a thing that you mill means if you mill your Lurgoyf that you need into play, you can put it into play. And then it can also get that buff as you fill up your graveyard. That buff has more potential to be bigger and bigger, which is really, really nice. So pretty cool. And then we've got the official version of Ulalek that was spoiled, Fused Atrocity. This is 5 mana. They're all hybrid mana, so it's either a Wooburg or 5 colorless, or any combination of those. For a 2/5 legendary Eldrazi with Devoid, so technically has no color. Whenever you cast an Eldrazi spell, you can pay 2 colorless Hedron mana. If you do, copy all spells you control, then copy all other activated and triggered abilities you control. You may choose new targets for the copies. So really, really powerful commander here, but I think what I like the best about it is the fact that you can literally build any color combination of deck you want to support this. You could do a colorless deck, you could do all 5 colors, you could do any combination of those as long as you have colorless mana to support the colors that you're not using. So it's pretty interesting to see a commander like this where you're not super restricted in what color your deck can be. It can just be whatever you want it to be, and you can make it work. Next up, we've got Disa the Restless. This is the actual commander for the Commander Precon for the Jund deck. This is a 5/6 legendary human scout for 5 mana in the colors of Jund. Whenever a Lurgoyf permanent card is put into your graveyard from anywhere other than the battlefield, you put it onto the battlefield. So this is going to work really, really well with that other Jund legendary creature we saw. And whenever one or more creatures you control deal combat damage to a player, you get to create a Tarmogoyf token. So obviously, if you're deep into Lurgoyf Tribal, this is going to be pretty insane. Makes a lot of sense. Moving on, we've got Omo, Queen of Vesuva. This is the official version that was spoiled. 1/5 legendary Shapeshifter Noble for 3 mana in the colors of Simic, and that 1 colored mana is a Simic hybrid mana, which is nice. So you only need either 1 green or 1 blue. You don't need both. Whenever Omo, Queen of Vesuva, enters the battlefield or attacks, put an everything counter on each of up to 1 target land and up to 1 target creature. Each land with an everything counter on it is every land type in addition to its other types. Each non-land creature with an everything counter on it is every creature type. So, pretty interesting here. I absolutely love Vesuvan Doppelganger. It's one of my favorite cards in Magic. So to see the theme of Vesuva in general be iterated on here and have an interesting card like this makes me pretty excited. Then we've also got Satya, Aetherflux Genius. This is 4 mana in the colors of Jeskai for a 3/5 legendary human artificer with menace and haste. Whenever Satya, Aetherflux Genius, attacks, you create a tapped and attacking token that's a copy of up to 1 other target non-token creature you control, and you get 2 energy. At the beginning of the next end step, you sacrifice that token unless you pay an amount of energy equal to its mana value. So pretty cool here. You can either keep making copies that are going to die at end of turn while building up an abundance of energy counters for some other crazy shenanigans, or you can use your deck to build up energy counters beforehand so that when you use this ability, you can make a copy of something huge and still just spend a bunch of energy counters to keep it, even if it's your first trigger. So a lot of versatility in how you can use Satya. I really like it. Moving on, we've got Aether Refinery. This is 2 red and 4 for an artifact. If you would get 1 or more energy, you get twice that many instead. So even more energy duplication here. and you can tap Aether Refinery to get an energy and then pay 1 or more energy, and if you do, create an XX black Aetherborn creature token, where X is the amount of energy paid this way. Really interesting card. Kind of reminds me of Phyrexian, what was that card called? I forget the name of the card. 4 mana, you pay an amount of life, and you know, you pay 4 and tap it, and it spits out a creature that's however much life you paid when it entered. Phyrexian. It's one of my favorite cards. I can't remember the name off the top of my head. I digress. It doesn't matter. This is gonna fit perfect into energy decks. This card is kind of insane in energy decks. Even if you're not making the XX, getting twice the amount of energy seems pretty nutty. Moving on, we've got Azlask, the Swelling Scourge. This is 3 mana for a 2/2 legendary Eldrazi. This might be the cheapest Mythic Eldrazi we've ever seen. Correct me in the comments if I'm wrong. Whenever Azlask, the Swelling Scourge, or another colorless creature you control dies, you get an experience counter, and you can pay a WUBRG, so 1 mana of each color, and creatures you control get +X/+X until end of turn, where X is the number of experience counters you have. Scions and Spawns you control gain Indestructible and Annihilator 1 until end of turn as well. What's cool about this is you can activate this ability multiple times if you have enough mana. So if you have like 3 mana of each color, granted that's a lot, but in Commander games, I've seen crazier, right? You could activate this 3 times, give everything +X/+X 3 times, and then everything gets Annihilator 1 3 times, so you could effectively have Annihilator 3, which is kind of crazy. This seems to work perfect with a deck that's going wide with Eldrazi Scion creature tokens. We've seen those everywhere. Just get a whole bunch of tokens on board, and as they die, as you sack them for mana, you get a bunch of experience counters built up, and then eventually you can activate this ability, and all of the ones you didn't sack that you're still going wide with get a huge buff and get Annihilator. Seems pretty cool. Seems like the deck kind of builds itself, but a really interesting card. Next up, we've got Kaith, Famed Mechanist. This is 4 mana in the colors of Jeskai for a 3/3 legendary dwarf artificer. It has Fabricate 1, so you either put a +1/+1 counter on Kaith, or create a 1/1 colorless servo artifact creature token when Kaith enters the battlefield. Other non-token creatures you control now have Fabricate 1, so all of the creatures that you play are going to be able to get that ability. You can also pay 2 and tap Kaith to choose one, either Populate or Proliferate. Populate's going to give you an extra token of any token type. Proliferate's going to give you an extra counter of every counter type. So, absolutely insane, whether you're going in a direction of piling up counters and proliferating, or making a bunch of tokens and populating. You can use this in a lot of different ways. And get a lot of value out of it. So, pretty crazy card. But before we get to the rares, really quickly, coffee break. Now, while I'm getting myself some Nectar of the Gods, I just wanted to take a brief second to remind you guys that not only do we have Commander cards for this set, we also have some special guest cards. We're going to be going over those a little bit later in the video, but rares are up next, and then Mythics will be at the end. Let's get back to it. Nectar. Nectar of the Gods. It's a necessity. These videos are long, and I need my coffee, you know? So anyway, we're going to move on to the rares. We're back to Modern Horizons 3 cards, no more Commander cards. Those are all done with, all out of the way. We're going to start with some cycles of cards and show all 5 cards for the cycle. So starting off here, we've got the Medallions. This is Pearl Medallion, an artifact for 2 mana. White spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. And we're going to see this for all of the colors. We've also got Sapphire Medallion here, 2 mana for an artifact. Blue spells you cast cost just 1 less to cast, which is nice. And then Jet Medallion, 2 mana for an artifact. Black spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. And Ruby Medallion, 2 mana for an artifact. Red spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. And then finally, Emerald Medallion, 2 mana for an artifact. Green spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. I probably didn't need to say that for every single one. I probably could have just showed you the pictures, but I did it. It's there. Anyway, these cards are really cool. They're going to be really powerful, especially in monocolor decks, right? almost like a Sol Ring, kind of better than a Sol Ring, right? Instead of tapping for a mana, it's basically giving you a mana for every spell you cast. So if you're casting multiple spells a turn, you're able to get that much more mana, basically, out of these medallions, more so than if you were running like a Mana Rock or something like that. So these cards are really, really good. But moving on, we've got the cycle of flares. Now, these are kind of similar to like the Force of Will cycle of cards where you can play something for free if you meet a certain condition. And the condition on the flares is that you have to sacrifice something. So Flare of Fortitude here is 2 white and 2 for an instant. You can sacrifice a non-token white creature rather than pay this spell's mana cost. And until end of turn, your life total can't change, and permanents you control gain hexproof and indestructible. So really, really powerful card here. Being able to play this for free by just sacrificing a creature is nuts, especially when you're usually going to use this to protect your board from like a sweeper, a Wrath of God or whatever. Losing your worst creature is much, much better than losing every creature. So really powerful. Next up, we've got Flare of Denial. This is 2 blue and 1 for an instant. You may sacrifice a non-token blue creature rather than pay this spell's mana cost, and it counters a spell. So not quite as good as Force of Will, because you have to have a creature in play to sacrifice if you want to play this for free. But the upside to this is if you're playing it as a normal counterspell for its mana cost, it is a bit more aggressively costed in that way. You know, Force of Will, you have to spend like 5 mana to hard cast it, so you're almost never actually hard casting it. This seems a little bit more reasonable. It seems much more like it's a counterspell meant to be a 3 mana counterspell that if you're in panic mode, if you absolutely need to counter something and don't have the mana, you have this other way of casting it. And if you view the card like that, I think it's a little bit better. Moving on, we've got Flare of Malice. This is 2 black and 2 for an instant. You can sacrifice a non-token black creature rather than pay this spell's mana cost. Each opponent sacrifices a creature or planeswalker with the greatest mana value among creatures and planeswalkers they control. So what makes this card so good is the fact that it's instant, right? You can just spend the mana, make them sack their best thing. If you do, it's a little bit overcosted. But having this backup way of like, oh no, I'm in a pinch, they just played something absolutely game breaking and I'm out of mana and can't deal with it, you just sack your crappy black creature, play this for free, make them get rid of their big thing before they can get value off of it. So pretty cool card. Next up, we've got Flare of Duplication. This is 2 red and 1 for an instant. You can sacrifice a non-token red creature rather than pay this spell's mana cost, and you copy target instant or sorcery spell. You may choose new targets for the copy. So getting like a way to copy a spell that costs you no mana actually seems kind of broken. I feel like this might be the best one of the entire cycle. It just seems crazy. You just need any red creature on the field. Anything that already, you know, did what you needed it to do when it entered the battlefield or whatever, and now it's just a crappy little creature left over. If you could think of any cards that perfectly fit that description that work really well with Flare of Duplication, definitely let me know in the comments. Because there's so much potential for this card to be absolutely absurd. To copy your best spell for no extra mana just seems insane, and there should be really easy ways to enable this. I'm just not sure what the best creatures for that would be for this one in particular. And then the last flare is Flare of Cultivation. 2 green and 1 for a sorcery. You can sacrifice a non-token green creature rather than pay this spell's mana cost. You search your library for up to 2 basic land cards, reveal those cards, put one onto the battlefield tapped and the other into your hand, and then shuffle. This card is also bananas, because if you can just get a creature into play on turn 1, something that you're mainly using for its ETB trigger, that you don't really care about the body afterwards, you can just very easily ramp out for free, and it just gets insane. So, really, really crazy card here as well. But moving on, we've got Genku, Future Shaper. This is a 2/5 legendary Moonfolk Wizard for 4 mana in the colors of Azorius. Whenever another non-token permanent you control leaves the battlefield, you get to choose one that hasn't been chosen this turn. Create a creature token with those characteristics. So you either make a 2/2 white fox with vigilance, or a 1/2 blue moonfolk with flying, or a 1/1 black rat with lifelink. You can also pay 5 mana in the colors of Azorius to put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. So this is kind of insane, right? Every single permanent that's an actual card that's not a token, when it leaves, is going to give you a token creature. Every single one. And you get to choose whatever you need. If you're desperate to block their flyers, you can make a Moonfolk, right? If you really just needed the lifelink to mitigate, the loss of life to aggro, you can make the rat. Like, the versatility here is crazy. All of your creatures, all of your permanents just replace themselves with tokens, and then having this activated ability on top just puts it way over the edge, in my opinion. So I think this card's absolutely insane. I love it. I don't know the best deck for it, but if you have ideas, definitely let me know in the comments, because I think the card is busto. Next up, we've got Detective's Phoenix. We saw this one in the leaks, but I'll go over it again. This is 1 red and 2 for a 2/2 enchantment creature Phoenix. It has Bestow for 1 red and collecting evidence 6, which means it can come back from your graveyard as an aura enchanting another creature if you pay that Bestow cost. It has flying and haste, so it's a 2/2 flying haste for 3. And if you bring it back for its Bestow cost, it's going to enchant another creature and give it +2/+2 in flying and haste. So a lot of value to be had here. Next up, we've got Volatile Storm Drake. This is essentially a new Gilded Drake. 2 mana for a 3/2 Drake with flying, and hexproof from activated and triggered abilities, which is pretty interesting. And when it enters, you can exchange control of it and target creature an opponent controls. If you do, you get 4 energy, and then sacrifice that creature unless you pay an amount of energy equal to its mana value. I absolutely love this card, and the way to really put it over the top is if you have ways to bounce the Storm Drake back to your hand. You could just keep stealing their things and sacrificing them until you build up enough energy that you bounce the Storm Drake back to your hand again, play it again, and this time you get to actually pay a bunch of energy, keep their really big thing that you stole. So, a lot of cool ways to use this, definitely with bounce spells. Next up, we've got Pearl Ear Imperial Advisor, 2 white and 1 for a 3/4 legendary Fox Advisor with lifelink. Enchantment spells you cast have affinity for auras, which is super interesting. Not just auras have affinity for auras, but all enchantments. And whenever you cast an aura spell that targets a modified permanent you control, you get to draw a card. So this is a new card for like Enchantress style decks. Will it be good enough? I don't know, but being able to reduce the cost of all your enchantments when you start going wide with your auras does seem like it has a really powerful ceiling you could work towards, and I'm sure there's a deck that's just begging to break this. Next up, we've got Thief of Existence. This is 3 mana for a 3/4 Eldrazi with Devoid, so it's technically no color, but it does cost 1 green mana, 1 colorless, and then 1 colorless Hedron mana to play it. When you cast this spell, you get to exile up to 1 target non-creature non-land permanent an opponent controls with mana value 4 or less. If you do, Thief of Existence gains when this creature leaves the battlefield, target opponent draws a card. So there's a lot to unpack with this one. We saw this over leak season, and I don't think people realize just how good it is. First of all, it triggers on cast, which means it can't be countered. It takes out very, very problematic permanents like the One Ring or 3 mana Teferi, which is absolutely nuts. And you can always just bounce this and replay it. And then when it does die, they don't get the thing back. That's like the big upside. Most things that exile like this, they give the thing back when the creature goes away. In this case, they just draw a card. But it's even better than that. You get to choose whichever opponent you want to draw the card. So you don't have to have the person whose permanent you exiled be the person that draws the card. You can use politics at a multiplayer table in Commander or whatnot to maybe make a different player draw a card, maybe one that you're allied with, or whatever the case may be. So pretty interesting all around. I really like the card. I think it has a lot of potential in both normal constructed like Modern and also in Commander decks. Next up, we've got Wheel of Potential, another one that we saw during leak season. This is 1 red and 2 for a sorcery. You get 3 energy, then you can pay any amount of energy. Each player may exile their hand and draw X cards. If X is 7 or more, you may play cards you own exiled this way until the end of your next turn. So, nice little variant on Wheel of Fortune here, except if you can build up a ton of energy before you cast it, you actually get to play all the stuff that you're getting rid of for free? No, not for free. You still have to pay the mana cost, but you can get a lot more card advantage by being able to play all of the things you're exiling. Essentially, if you're in a position where you can just play out your hand, instead you play this, exile your whole hand, play it all anyway, and then redraw a bunch of cards. So, pretty cool. Next up, we've got 6, another one we saw during league season. This is 1 green and 2 for a 2/4 legendary tree folk with reach. As long as it's your turn, non-land permanent cards in your graveyard have retrace. That means you can discard a land from your hand to recast any permanent from your graveyard as if it was in your hand. You still have to pay the mana costs and all that, but that is an insanely powerful ability, especially when you look at 6's other ability here. When he attacks, you mill 3 cards and can put a land from among them into your hand. So you can keep digging to find another land to put into your graveyard to get back into your hand so that you have something to then discard to replay a permanent in your graveyard with retrace, and you can just keep going. But obviously the best way to use this is if you have other ways of getting lands back from your graveyard to your hand. Then you can just kind of go infinite. You can cast something every single turn, get back your land, discard it to retrace something, and just keep replaying the things from your graveyard, which is kind of insane. Next up, we've got White Orchid Phantom, probably the best version of White Knight I've ever seen. 2/2 flying first strike for 2 white mana, and when it enters the battlefield, you get to destroy up to 1 target non-basic land, and its controller can search their library for a basic land and put it onto the battlefield tapped and then shuffled. So it's just got land destruction stapled onto a really, really good 2-drop body. And obviously, if you have ways to like blink this, you could re-trigger the ability a bunch of times. It's worth noting that in older formats like Modern, people run way less basic lands. So the fact that this hits non-basics and lets them replace it with a basic is actually way, way better in those older formats and could be super, super relevant. So just a really good card. Next up, we've got Power Balance. This is 2 red mana for an enchantment. Whenever an opponent casts a spell, you may reveal the top card of your library. If you do, you may cast that card without paying its mana cost if the 2 spells have the same mana value. So all you have to do is use this with something like Sensei's Divining Top or Scroll Rack, where you can manipulate the top of your deck and get whatever you want on top. And you have the ability to play things for free if you know what your opponent's going to be casting, how much mana they're going to be spending on their cards. So really interesting. You have to have a lot of foresight. It's a lot like Counterbalance, but with a completely different payoff. It's just a really interesting card that could be really, really powerful the more ways you have of manipulating the top of your deck and kind of seeing what your opponent has planned for the next turn. Next up, we've got Crick, Son of Yawgmoth. This is a 2/2 legendary Phyrexian horror minion for a whopping 7 mana. It's 4 colorless and 3 black Phyrexian mana, which means you could play this for just 4 colorless if you pay 6 life, which is a lot of life, but still, you get a 2/2 life linker, and then for each black in a cost, you may pay 2 life rather than pay that mana. So basically, all black mana costs become black Phyrexian mana costs, which is insane. And whenever you cast a black spell, you get to put a +1/+1 counter on Crick, Son of Yawgmoth. So if you're using this in a deck with a lot of life gain, you could just completely go off the rails and do some really crazy stuff if you're playing cards like Corrupt and Drain Life. Just a lot of value you can have with this. And then the more black spells you cast, the bigger Crick's gonna get, and he is a life linker, so when he swings or blocks, he's just gonna gain back all that life that you're spending in order to play your spells way cheaper for their Phyrexian mana cost. It's kind of just perfectly works with itself, but obviously there are gonna be way more ways to break this. If you have ideas about specifically what cards you'd want to use to break this guy wide open, definitely let me know in the comments, because the potential is there. I think this card is insane. But we're going to move on. We have special guests in this set. So before we get to the actual mythics that are a part of Modern Horizons 3 in this video, we're just going to briefly go over the special guests. Now, it's important to note these special guest cards, they have a randomness. They can appear in a common slot, but it's very, very rare. When they do, they'll just replace a common in the pack. And you can use these in limited, in drafts and sealed and stuff, which is pretty interesting. First up, we have Expressive Iteration, 2 mana in the colors of Izzet. You look at the top 3 cards of your library, put one of them into your hand, one of them on the bottom of your library, and then exile one of them and you may play it. Normally you're going to choose a land for that just to get as much value as you can. This is a card that originally came out in Strixhaven, and it was very, very underappreciated at first until people started to realize just how insane this card was. So I'm not surprised it made it onto a guest list sheet. Next up, we've got Prismatic Ending, 1 white and X for a sorcery with Converge. You exile target non-land permanent if its mana value is less than or equal to the number of colors of mana spent to cast this spell. So, the bigger thing you want to exile, the more different colors of mana you have to use to cast this. So this card's going to be best in like a 5-color deck, but pretty interesting piece of removal. Next up, we've got Dismember. This is 3 mana for an instant. Target creature gets -5/-5 until end of turn. But what's worth noting is the 2 black mana in the cost are Phyrexian mana, which means theoretically you could just pay 4 life and then instant speed gives something -5/-5 for just 1 colorless mana, which is kind of crazy. Absolutely bonkers card. Yeah. Next up, we've got Persist. 1 black and 1 for a sorcery. Return target non-legendary creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield with a -1/-1 counter on it. Yeah, sure, it has a -1/-1 counter on it. Who cares? This is a 2 mana reanimation spell for any non-legendary creature. That's just insane. This card's insane. That's all that needs to be said about that. It's an insane card. But next on, we have the Thought-Knot Seer. This is 4 mana for a 4/4 Eldrazi. One of those colorless mana has to be a colorless Hedron mana. And when Thought-Knot Seer enters the battlefield, target opponent reveals their hand. You choose a non-land card from it and exile that card. And when Thought-Knot Seer leaves the battlefield, target opponent draws a card. So, really good card here. You getting to choose any non-land and exile it is pretty good. And it being a enters the battlefield trigger means that you could technically flicker this and just keep doing it, which is kind of nuts. Sure, target opponent gets to draw a card when it leaves the battlefield. We also got a 4/4 body for 4, so just a really good card. And then next up we have the cycle of 5 elemental incarnations, 1 for each color. These are also going to be special guest cards in Modern Horizons 3. First up we have Solitude, 5 mana for a 3/2 flash lifelink. When Solitude enters the battlefield, you exile up to 1 other target creature, and that creature's controller gains life equal to its power, so sort of like a Swords to Plowshares stapled to it, and you can evoke it. You can exile a white card from your hand to just get the ability and not the creature. Moving on, we have Subtlety, 2 blue and 2 for a 3/3 flyer with flash. It's also an elemental incarnation. Whenever Subtlety enters the battlefield, you choose up to 1 target creature spell or planeswalker spell. Its owner puts it on the top or bottom of their library. And again, you can evoke this and just get that pseudo counterspell style ability by exiling a blue card from your hand and just not get the creature. Next up, we've got Grief. This is 2 black and 2 for a 3/2 menace. It is an elemental incarnation. When Grief enters the battlefield, target opponent reveals their hand. You get to choose a non-land card from it, and that player discards that card. And again, you can evoke this by exiling a black card from your hand, which is kind of crazy. Being able to make them discard any non-land card for no mana is kind of wild. But again, if you evoke it, you don't get the creature, you just get the ability. We've also got Fury here, 2 red and 3 for a 3/3 double striking elemental incarnation. When he enters the battlefield, it deals 4 damage divided as you choose among any number of target creatures and or players. And you can evoke it by exiling a red card from your hand, so could potentially be a free 4 damage divided as you choose. And I think that's what makes this card so good, is the fact that you can divide that damage however you need. Sometimes you can kill 2 things and make it so that if you are evoking it and you are getting card disadvantage in order to forego a mana cost, sometimes you can make up that card disadvantage by 2-for-1ing your opponent and getting back to where you were, back to 0 as far as being down a card or up a card, which makes it really, really good. But we're going to move on. This is the last of the cycle. Endurance, 2 green and 1 for a 3/4 elemental incarnation with flash and reach. When it enters the battlefield, up to 1 target player puts all the cards from their graveyard on the bottom of their library in a random order. So You get all the graveyard stuff back in your library, but you can also use this to hit your opponent if they're specifically trying to fill up their graveyard for self-mill purposes, reanimation purposes, if they have flashback cards, escape cards, all that stuff, you can make them get rid of it all. So pretty versatile, and again, you can evoke this for exiling a green card from your hand, and then you get that ability, but you just don't get the creature. But I mean, for no mana, sometimes if you're in a pinch, it can absolutely be worth it. But that's the last of the special guest cards. We're going to move on to the mythics. And we've got a bunch of planeswalkers that are flip planeswalkers. These are also things that we saw during leak season, but we have the official cards now, so we're just going to go over them very quickly here. 1 blue, this is Tamiyo Inquisitive Student. 1 blue for a 0/3 legendary Moonfolk Wizard with flying. Whenever it attacks, you get to investigate, and when you draw your 3rd card in a turn, you get to exile her and return her to the battlefield transformed. She comes back as Tamiyo Seasoned Scholar, which is a legendary planeswalker Tamiyo with 2 loyalty. Has a +2 loyalty ability until your next turn. Whenever a creature attacks you or a planeswalker you control, it gets -1/-0 until end of turn. Has a -3 ability, return target instant or sorcery card from your graveyard to your hand. If it's a green card, you add 1 mana of any color. -7, draw cards equal to half the number of cards in your library rounded up. You get an emblem with you have no maximum hand size. So pretty powerful, pretty cheap to get out. Definitely let me know what sort of decks or card combos would work best with Tamiyo, you think. But we're going to move on to Sorin of House Markov. 1 black and 1 for a 1/4 legendary human noble with lifelink. Also has Extort, so whenever you cast a spell, you can pay 1 Orzhov hybrid mana, and if you do, each opponent loses a life, and you gain a life, so you get to drain for 1. At the beginning of your post-combat main phase, if you gain 3 or more life this turn, you exile Sorin, return him to the battlefield transformed as Sorin Ravenous Neonate. 3 loyalty planeswalker, also has Extort, and has a +2 loyalty ability to make a food token, a -1 to deal damage equal to the amount of life you gained this turn to any target, and a -6 to gain control of target creature. It becomes a vampire in addition to its other types, and you can put a lifelink counter on it if you control a white permanent other than that creature or Sorin. So you do have to be in an Orzhov deck in order to get that lifelink counter, which is kind of interesting. But I think the best way to use this is honestly just to gain a whole bunch of life the turn you flip it, and not only will gaining more than 3 life flip it, but then you'll immediately have access to this -1, this -1 ability, and be able to deal that much damage. It doesn't care that you gained the life before it flipped, it just cares that you gained the life this turn. So that same crazy amount of life you gain to flip Sorin can also be the crazy amount of life you gain to, you know, effectively make this -1 into a potential just win the game on the spot sort of ability by targeting the opponent's head. So if you're in a deck that can just go off and gain a ton of life in 1 turn, this could be crazy. But just like all of the planeswalkers, let me know in the comments if you specifically have a deck or a card combination that this would be amazing in. Next up, we've got Ral, Leyline Prodigy. Hold on a second. Ral Monsoon Mage, a 1 red and 1 for a 1/3 legendary human wizard. Instant and sorcery spells you cast cost 1 less to cast, and whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell during your turn, you get to flip a coin. If you lose the flip, it deals 1 damage to you, but if you win, you get to exile Ral and bring it back transformed. So this one's a little tricky because there is a chance you don't flip it. You just have to keep casting instants and sorceries, keep flipping coins until you finally win one, and then it's going to come back as the Planeswalker, which is Ral Leyline Prodigy here. 2 loyalty, legendary Planeswalker Ral. When he enters the battlefield, he enters with an additional loyalty counter on him for each instant and sorcery spell you've cast this turn. So if you had to cast a bunch of instants and sorceries in order to finally get this guy to flip, at least he's going to come in with way more loyalty, which is nice. +1 loyalty until your next turn. Instant and sorcery spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. You could still get that cost reduction if you need it. -2, and he deals 2 damage divided as you choose among 1 or 2 targets. And you draw a card if you control a blue permanent other than Ral. So another upside here where if you're playing in Izzet, even though you don't have to be to play Ral, if you are, you get a little bit of extra value. And then -8, exile the top 8 cards of your library. You may cast instant and sorcery spells from among them this turn without paying their mana cost. So incredibly powerful ultimate there. But again, let me know where you think this Planeswalker slots best in, what deck you'd use it in, what card combinations you think absolutely break it. And moving on, we've got Grist Voracious Larva. 1 green for a 1/2 legendary insect with Death Touch. When it or another creature enters the battlefield under your control, if it entered from your graveyard or you cast it from your graveyard, you can add 1 green mana. And if you do, you exile Grist and then return it to the battlefield transformed under its owner's control. So all you have to do is just reanimate this from your graveyard, like self-mill it into your graveyard turn 1, turn 2, bring it back with some kind of reanimation spell, and you're going to get that 1 green mana and flip it immediately. When you flip it, it becomes Grist the Plague Swarm, a 3 loyalty planeswalker, +1, and you create a 1/1 black and green insect creature token and then mill 2 cards. Put a Death Touch counter on the token if a black card was milled this way. So again, another payoff if you are in Golgari, even though you don't need to be in Golgari to play this. -2, you can destroy any artifact or enchantment, getting access to incidental artifact and enchantment removal early in the game. In the decks that can really go off with Grist can be really, really good. And then -6 for each creature card in your graveyard. You create a token that's a copy of it, except it's a 1/1 black and green insect. So really powerful ultimate. If you can fill your graveyard up with insane creatures that have abilities that make them good, not necessarily their power and toughness, you're going to get copies of all of those creatures. And even though they're 1/1s, all of their abilities will remain intact, and it can be incredibly powerful. So just like all the Planeswalkers, let me know in the comments if you have the perfect deck for this or the perfect card to combo with it. I'd really like to hear your thoughts. Moving on, we've got Breya Ethereum Shaper. I'm pretty sure this is a reprint. I'm not 100%, but let me know in the comments if it is or not. This is a 4/4 legendary artifact creature human for 4 mana, everything but green, 1 red, 1 black, 1 blue, 1 white. When Breya Ethereum Shaper enters the battlefield, you get to create 2 1/1 blue Thopter artifact creature tokens with flying, and then you can pay 2 at any time and sack 2 artifacts to choose one of these abilities. Either Breya deals 3 damage to target player or planeswalker, or target creature gets -4/-4 until end of turn, or you gain 5 life. So she's obviously going to be really, really good with any kind of a go wide artifact deck where you can constantly have access to these abilities, whatever you happen to need. If you're up against aggro, you can gain life. You can kill things with indestructible with that -4/-4. You can kill planeswalkers with the 3 damage. Lots of versatility, but the fact that it gives you two 1/1 flying Thopters on ETB gives you that extra value immediately is what kind of pushes it over the top. So even if your opponent kills Breya, you're still left with some value, which is really, really nice. Moving on, we've got another reprint. I'm pretty sure it's a reprint. Let me know in the comments if I'm wrong or right. This is a 2/2 legendary human cleric with flying, Kaalia of the Vast, for 4 mana in the colors of Mardu. Whenever Kaalia of the Vast attacks an opponent, you may put an angel, demon, or dragon creature card from your hand onto the battlefield tapped and attacking that opponent. What I like about this card so much is the fact that you don't have to be into angels, demons, and dragons to make it good, right? You can be all in on angels, or all in on demons, or all in on dragons, and this can still be a really, really good card. But you can also mix and match them, make a deck using, you know, all 3 or just 2 of the 3, and it's still going to work just as well. So I like that versatility. I like that you can kind of go multiple different directions with this card, and I absolutely love Mardu. So really, really cool card in my opinion. Glad to see it. Next up, we've got Eladamri Korvek Doll. That's right, Eladamri's finally the Korvek Doll. 3/3 legendary elf warrior for 2 green and 1. You may look at the top card of your library at any time, and you may cast creature spells from the top of your library. If that was it, it would still be really good. But the last ability it has is even more busted. You can pay 1 green mana, tap it, tap 2 untapped creatures you control, reveal a card from your hand or the top card of your library. If you reveal a creature card this way, you put it onto the battlefield. And you can only activate during your turn, but it can be activated at instant speed. So it's not, can only be activated at sorcery speed. Definitely worth noting, because you can activate this in the middle of combat while you're swinging at your opponent, and most elf tribal decks are going to love being able to drop a Craterhoof in the middle of combat, that's going to make this card absolutely insane. And like I said, on top of the ability to just be able to play creatures from the top of your library anyway, which sometimes elf tribal decks do have a little bit of trouble with running out of gas. They vomit out their hand really quick. So this guy just kind of does everything you want in that deck, and I think it's pretty crazy. But moving on, we've got Ulamog the Defiler, a whopping 10 mana for a 7/7 legendary Eldrazi. When you cast this spell, target opponent exiles half their library rounded up. Insane. It has Ward, sacrifice 2 permanents, so your opponent has to basically 3-for-1 themselves in order to target this with removal and get rid of it after they already lost half their library. Gross. Ulamog the Defiler enters the battlefield with a number of +1/+1 counters on it equal to the greatest mana value among cards in exile. Now, what's important to note about that is it doesn't care if it exiled the things. It doesn't even care if the things are in your opponent's exile or your exile. It just looks at everything that's in exile, and whatever has the greatest mana value, that's the thing it's going to look at, and that's how many +1/+1 counters Ulamog's going to enter with, which is kind of crazy. It has Annihilator X, where X is the number of +1/+1 counters on it. So not only can it come in as a huge creature with a huge Annihilator ability, but you can just find ways of adding extra +1/+1 counters onto this later in the game. If you're in a +1/+1 counters deck, just keep popping counters on it, and its Annihilator X is going to keep scaling up and become absolutely ridiculous, which I kind of love. This card seems bananas. I don't know which deck it's going to be best in, but there's absolutely got to be a home for this, right? It's just insane. If you think you know where it's going to slot best, let me know in the comments. Moving on, we've got Kozilek the Broken Reality. This is another one we saw during leak season, but we've got the official card here, finally spoiled by Wizards. This is a 9/9 legendary Eldrazi for 9 mana. When you cast the spell, up to 2 target players each manifest 2 cards from their hands, and for each card manifested this way, you draw a card. Other colorless creatures you control get +3/+2. So if you manifest yourself, you get 2 5/4s and your 9/9 and draw 2 cards. If you manifest your opponent, they have to manifest 2 cards. They don't have a choice. So it's almost like a mind rot. If they have things they need to cast, like counter spells or removal or whatever, it's almost like a mind rot tacked on. You're forcing them to get rid of them, turn them into 2/2 colorless creatures, which is kind of crazy, and you get to draw cards for those as well. This is like, what, a 7-for-1 or something insane? I don't know. If you're in a multiplayer game, you can actually target 2 of your opponents, make them essentially both get mind rotted, get rid of 2 cards from their hand, and you get to draw 4 as well. Now, I think usually you'll probably want to pick yourself as one of the targets because being able to buff your own colorless creatures with +3/+2 just seems really, really powerful. But regardless, the versatility here is insane. The card advantage is insane. Basically forcing your opponents to have to discard 2 cards and you draw 2 cards for it is nuts. I think the card is just insane. And again, it's a cast trigger, so the trigger can't be countered. They have to do it immediately before the spell resolved, which means if they only have 2 cards left in their hand and one of them is removal and they want to kill this thing after it enters the battlefield, they can't, because on cast, they have to manifest that card as a 2/2, and then when it finally resolves and enters the battlefield, now they don't have a hand. They can't get rid of it. So, card's pretty cracked in my opinion. But we're going to move on to Shadow of the Second Sun. This is 2 blue and 4 for an enchantment aura. It enchants a player. At the beginning of enchanted player's post-combat main phase, there is an additional beginning phase after this phase. The end step happens after the added untap, upkeep, and draw steps. So this card's a little complicated and hard to unpack, but what it basically means is either yourself or another player that you enchant, it can be either or, you get your attack phase, and then after your attack phase, before it gets to your next main phase, you get an untap, upkeep, draw. You don't get extra main phases or anything like that. You don't get extra attack phases, none of that stuff. Just untap, upkeep, and draw, which is interesting. It's a lot like that card we've just saw in Thunder Junction, Obeka, that gives you an additional upkeep, except you also get an additional untap and draw step. You can also force your opponent to get an extra untap, upkeep, and draw step, which, depending on what kind of shenanigans you have lined up with your deck, could theoretically be useful. If you have something detrimental happening to them during their upkeeps, you know, you might want to choose them. The fact that you have the ability to do that, I don't think it's going to happen very often, but it's pretty cool. Most of the time, you're going to choose yourself. You're going to be able to untap all of your mana so that you can use it again during your second main phase. You're going to get an upkeep trigger for all of your things that care about upkeep, and you're going to get to draw an extra card. So there's a lot of value that this card gives you. It's almost like taking an extra turn, honestly, without the extra combat. It's pretty much everything but the extra combat. You're getting the extra draw. You're getting to use your mana twice in a turn, almost like you took 2 turns as far as how much stuff you cast, and you're getting 2 upkeep triggers. So really the only things you're missing out on as far as like a time warp or time walk style take an extra turn card is just anything that might trigger at the end of your turn. You're only going to get that trigger once, and then your combat step. So kind of interesting here. It's a way to have almost like a time walk variant without actually being a time walk variant. And then what makes it even crazier is the fact that it enchants a player, so it happens every turn. It's not just once. If this was just once, it would already be pretty crazy, although probably not good enough at 6 mana. But the 6 mana is absolutely justified when you realize this happens to you every turn. So it's almost like you get to take an extra turn every turn for the rest of the game, with the exception of your combat step. So if you're in a control deck that doesn't really care about how many combats you get, doesn't need combats to win the game, and just want to take over control of the board, this is going to be insane. I think the more I think about this card, the deeper I think about this card, the more I think this card is absolutely cracked and bonkers. There's going to be some kind of crazy deck that uses this for sure. Let me know in the comments what deck this belongs in, because this card is bananas, man. This is like a time walk every single turn, basically, except without the combat. That's crazy. That's just absolutely crazy. Getting to use all of your mana in your first main phase, and then untap and use it all again in your second main phase. It's just crazy. This card's nuts. Let me know in the comments where it's going to see play. And the last card of today is Arna Kennerud, Sky Captain. 5 mana in the colors of Esper for a 4/4 legendary human knight with flying and lifelink. It has ward, discard a card, and whenever a modified creature you control attacks, you double the number of each kind of counter on it, and then for each non-token permanent attached to it, you create a token that's a copy of that permanent attached to that creature. This is kind of insane. This is good for tokens and for +1/+1 counters, but like other +1/+1 counter cards, it's not just, I should say, unlike other +1/+1 counter cards, it's not just doubling the number of +1/+1 counters, it's doubling the number of every kind of counter, which is just crazy. And some of those counters aren't going to care if they're multiplied. If you have a menace counter on something, they don't get double menace, right? But I'm sure there are some instances where other types of counters on a card being multiplied are absolutely going to matter. And if you're somehow able to use this with Planeswalkers in a deck where a Planeswalker can become a creature and then swing, it can swing as a modified creature and then double the number of loyalty counters on it, which seems insane. But also if you're in a deck that's playing, you know, auras or equipment or anything like that, that's equipped or enchanting a creature, all of those get replicated as well. You get doubles of all of those, and that just seems, the versatility of how you can use this seems insane. It seems like there's a lot of different ways and different decks that can use this. I don't know if there's one deck that's going to utilize every single aspect of this card in the same deck, but I don't know. It just seems crazy. You gotta let me know in the comments if there's a specific type of counter that's not a +1/+1 counter that you'd like to double up on your creatures. Because I can't really think of anything off the top of my head, but there's gotta be something out there, right? Where if you get multiples of those counters on your creatures, it's actually beneficial. So if you have any ideas of that, let me know in the comments. In fact, if you have any ideas in general of just what deck you'd want to play this in and what broken ways you'd have to just bust this card wide open, because I'm sure they exist. That ability just seems insane, whether you're going the counters direction or the aura equipment direction, or maybe both. You gotta let me know where it's gonna see play and where it's gonna be used best, because the card just seems absurd. But that's the last card of the day. Spoiler season is technically just beginning, so we'll have more videos on the way as soon as more cards drop, so look forward to those. If you haven't already, please, please, please like the video. It helps me out so much. It helps the video get out to more people, and it's all of you guys that are liking the videos every time I drop them that are helping this channel to grow so quickly. We're almost to 9,000 subscribers already. We just hit 8,000. It seems like yesterday, so we're growing so fast, and that's because of you guys. Thank you so, so much. If you're new here, subscribe so you don't miss any of my content. Tons of cool spoiler content coming. Tons of crazy deck techs for Thunder Junction on the way. Look forward to that. I'm excited about drafting Modern Horizons 3 on Arena. I'll be doing that a lot on Twitch as soon as it drops. If you'd like to catch me live over on Twitch, I stream Monday through Friday, except for when I'm really, really busy trying to get content done for YouTube. Sometimes I skip days, but I try to stream every Monday through Friday. That's twitch.tv/quarantined_Capricorn, because if I'm alive and I'm breathing, I'm there and I'm streaming. I'm really tired and I need more coffee, so I'm going to end this video. Thanks for checking it out, and I'll see you tomorrow. Thanks so much for checking out my channel. I'd like to give a huge shout out to all of my patrons over at Patreon. Without you guys, this channel would not be possible, so honestly, thank you from the bottom of my heart for all of your contributions. If you haven't yet, like and subscribe. The more likes we get and the quicker we get them, the bigger this channel will grow and the faster it will grow. I'd love nothing more than this channel to become something very special for you guys, but it's entirely up to you how fast that happens. Also, if you'd like more deck techs, that's somewhere over there, and if you'd like to see what else the channel's been up to lately, that's somewhere up that way. Also, subscribe, circle below, do all the things.